You might think of the medieval period as reserved and puritanical, but medieval people had very different and more relaxed attitudes towards obscenity and sex. Be prepared to hear a few harsh words and shocking truths. When you think about the Tower of London and the medieval period more generally, pleasure probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind. We're taught that the Middle Ages were an unrelentingly grim time, filled with plagues, wars, and the church hiding under your bed to make sure you don't have too much fun. Additionally, the church didn't want you to have a lot of fun, and many surviving sources from the medieval period come from the Catholic Church. If you're a clergy member devoted to piety and asceticism, you're not going to be encouraging your flock to have a lot of fun. In this series, we'll uncover the sumptuous world of medieval pleasure, from sex to booze to sport. We'll explore how people in the Middle Ages enjoyed themselves and sometimes each other, starting with everyone's favorite subject, sex. To start our exploration of medieval sex, let's head to York, one of the most important cities in medieval England, rivaled only in size by London itself. York is a great place to understand what people were getting up to, because with so many people around, someone was having sex. The Middle Ages were about 700 years ago, and it's easy to forget that people back then were normal too. We're in the Shambles in York, a thriving centre of commerce, fun, and booze, an ideal place to understand what it was like for medieval ancestors looking for a bit of fun. Grape Lane? That name has a kind of secret about what used to happen here. Grape Lane is a contraction of grap, which this street was originally recorded as being. There are grape lanes throughout Britain, including one in Suffolk. There's also a record of whore lane, horse mount, and sit-down hoe. Medieval people didn't mess around when naming their streets. You needed to know where to go. You have all these literal names about what you can buy there, like Milk Street, Poultry Street, and Grape Street. Sex work was a medieval institution, and it was out in the open. It was as much a part of York as the Minster and the cobbled streets, and that's true throughout the medieval world. They had a more open attitude, though they regulated it usually by zoning. It was restricted to certain areas, but was very prevalent and visible. In modern society, it's more hidden away. We don't have streets named after it, but we do have areas where you know you can go. In a deeply patriarchal world, sex work was a lucrative option, and everyone knew about it. Authorities tolerated it, but needed to identify sex workers, so they had sumptuary laws and rulings, like requiring them to wear specific clothing or even bells. It often became a trendsetter, as in Vienna, where sex workers wore bells, and then high-class ladies began to imitate them. It busts the myth that people in the medieval period didn't bathe. They did bathe and were conscious of smelling bad. They had public and communal bathing. Sex workers were often found in these bathhouses, which were linked to brothels. The slang term lavender for sex workers came from the lavender used to fragrance laundry and bathhouses. It was common and associated with sex work. Medieval people had regular flirtations too. I've gathered some medieval pickup lines from Andreas Capilano's De Amore, or The Art of Courtly Love. The Catholic Church quite literally towered over medieval cities like York, serving as a constant physical reminder of how people should live their lives in public and private. For medieval Christians, sex was a moral tightrope. Everyone had to have sex to have children, but the Church believed any sex beyond procreation was sinful. The Church's position was that sex was only acceptable between married people for procreative purposes. Additionally, there were rules like no sex on Saturdays and Sundays, only having sex in the missionary position, and not getting fully naked during sex. In short, sex should be as joyless as possible. However, nobody really followed these rules. Surprisingly, some of the biggest rule breakers were clergy members. Historical documents from 14th century Prague reveal priests living openly with concubines, operating brothels, and engaging regularly with sex workers. One priest even fled a brothel naked down the streets of Prague, seen by his parishioners, making clear that not even the clergy followed the rules. To get a better idea of medieval sex lives, it's helpful to look at their living conditions. Bedrooms during this period were not comfortable or private. For example, a servant's room would almost certainly be shared. Privacy was rare, so people often had to make do with whatever space they had, which could include sex in shared rooms or even outdoors. One of my favorite medieval references to sex comes from a penitential guidebook by Burchard of Worms, which includes questions like whether someone has ever made an object in the shape and size to match their carnal desire and used it on another person. While actual sexual objects from the medieval period are rare, other resources offer more insights into medieval people's sex lives. We don't have medieval objects, but we definitely do have medieval images of sex. Evidence of sex in medieval manuscripts, especially in the marginalia, the little doodles that perplex scholars ever since they were written, exists. Many are from the late medieval period, particularly the 15th century, and come from the lowlands. It's fascinating because it shows us different ways medieval people related to pilgrimage and sex. While on pilgrimage, you might engage in a lot of sex due to plenary indulgence, meaning any sins you commit, such as having sex, will be forgiven. In England, this involved a priest blessing the bed, followed by a party where the king and queen enjoyed spiced wine. Groomsmen and bridesmaids would then throw stockings, and if you hit the royal couple, you would be the next to marry. After the festivities, the king and queen would close the bed curtains and consummate the marriage, which was essential for it to be considered legitimate. This involvement of courtiers in the royal sex life reflects the importance of marriage and heirs for the dynasty. Contrary to the often unromantic nature of royal sex, courtly love offered a more refined and romantic view. Courtly love involved unmarried men writing love songs and poetry for married women, often engaging in non-procreative types of sex to avoid endangering marriages. While courtly love literature warned against procreative sex, medieval people were still exploring and pushing boundaries of what was acceptable and romantic. In conclusion, medieval people had a varied and vibrant approach to sex and sexuality. They were comfortable with public sex, raunchy humor, and mixing pleasures like sex with alcohol. For example, a 15th century poem titled The Maid-Servant's Holiday humorously describes a sexual encounter amidst a festival. This poem and others show that medieval people mixed pleasure with festivities and weren't shy about expressing their sexuality.